It begins just before dawn, in a dusty village outside Addis Ababa. At 4:30 a.m., only the faint outlines of huts and fields are visible. A single truck rumbles through the darkness, its cargo, solar panels, water pumps, laptops. It's part of a new wave of aid quietly flowing in from New Delhi as the sun's first light strikes. The edges of the truck's metal, you sense something has shifted. The old giant USAID, once the dominant player in Ethiopia's aid ecosystem, is receding, and a new contender is stepping in. For decades, USAID was woven into Ethiopia's development fabric, funding schools, health clinics, food security, rural roads, community projects. In 2023, the U.S. committed $1.46 billion in aid to Ethiopia, making it among the top recipients globally. Yet in recent years, cracks have appeared in that system. Reports of diverted food aid, inefficiencies, and oversight lapses have shaken confidence. In late 2023, large portions of USAID's operations in Ethiopia were paused when investigations revealed that food meant for famine-stricken regions had been sold on local markets. Meanwhile, India has quietly begun offering alternatives, lines of credit, tech infrastructure, soft diplomacy programs. Ethiopia is being courted not with empty promises, but with tangible projects. But why would Addis Ababa pivot? And how far will the U.S. push back? The sunrise over the highlands signals the beginning of this new chapter. We'll trace the rise of India's influence, the unraveling of USAID dominance, and the hidden conflicts playing out behind the scenes. By 2006, India launched the Pan-African E-Network project, which connected Ethiopian institutions to telemedicine and remote education links in New Delhi. It was one of India's earliest soft power moves in Africa. Ethiopia became one of the pilot nations. Over time, that network expanded, building trust, technical capacity, and relationships that the U.S. had rarely cultivated at that scale. But this was just the opening gambit. What followed would fundamentally alter aid in Ethiopia. In the mid-2010s, when USAID faced criticism over mismanagement or allegations of corruption in its aid programs, Ethiopian leaders grew uneasy. In parallel, India offered lines of credit, infrastructure deals, and technical partnerships with fewer political strings. India's offers often came without lecture, more quietly, less conspicuously, and with fewer conditions. This difference began to look appealing in Addis Ababa. In 2024, the U.S. government announced that some functions of USAID in Ethiopia would be transferred to the State Department as part of a restructuring of bilateral aid oversight. This move was controversial. Many in the aid sector understood it as a retreat or a reconfiguration, signaling that the U.S. was stepping back from development work in certain corners of Ethiopia. That vacuum would not remain empty for long. One region hit hardest was Tigray. The U.S. had long funded nutrition programs, mobile clinics, emergency food supplies there. But after the 2023 pause on aid following revelations of widespread diversion, many programs shrank or stopped entirely. In displaced persons in IDP camp, thousands went without basic food rations. "We will just die in silence," some locals said, as lines at feeding centers vanished. As the U.S. pulled back, India's influence quietly crept forward. Ethiopian officials began touring Indian cities Hyderabad, Bangalore to inspect digital infrastructure, solar microgrid systems, and modular schools. Contracts were quietly signed. The new trucks and solar panels rolled in, the kind we saw at 4:30 a.m. These weren't just goodwill gestures, they were strategic moves. In one region, where USAID once funded a conservation initiative that protected nearly 197,000 hectares, the funds were abruptly cut. Local leaders, accustomed to external support, scrambled to keep up. The conservation program, which had helped reduce poaching and promote ecotourism, suddenly lost its backbone. In its place, Indian firms began surveying reforestation projects, offering climate money, and planting teams. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Meanwhile, in the capital Addis Ababa, corridors of power were rearranging. The Ethiopian government, under pressure from a shrinking USAID pipeline, introduced a new tax on all workers to fill the gap left by USAID's pause. Parliament approved contributions from both public and private sector employees, channeling money into a new disaster response fund tied to formerly USAID-sponsored programs. The message was clear: Ethiopia would no longer hinge entirely on external aid, and if the U.S. couldn't deliver, someone else would. In private boardrooms in New Delhi and Addis, calculations were made: where to step in, how much leverage to gain. India's lines of credit, cheaper infrastructure offers, and willingness to work less publicly gave it an edge. Local contractors who once relied on U.S. NGOs now found themselves in joint ventures with Indian enterprises, but a deeper fault line remained: trust and accountability. USAID's failures had damaged its credibility. The internal audit of emergency food assistance revealed that monitoring was insufficient, reporting obligations lax, and oversight inconsistent. Ethiopia's government seized on these reports to argue that USAID had grown too intrusive, too opaque. At the same time, India's model was gradually positioning itself as leaner, more flexible, less meddlesome. One evening, in a conference room at 9 p.m., Ethiopian officials discussed whether to allow Indian firms to control key infrastructure projects in telecom, energy, water management. The debates were heated. Some feared new strings attached. Others saw the repression of USAID as a national humiliation they must reverse. Elections were looming, allegiances shifting. In remote districts, men and women queued for aid first under US NGO tents, then under Indian-branded trucks. In one village, a clinic built with US funds shut down because supplies stopped. 3 months later, an Indian medical NGO reopened functions with telemedicine support. In another, wells funded by Indian loans began replacing US-installed boreholes whose pumps had long broken down. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but bit by bit, India was threading itself into Ethiopia's development architecture. By the time the US reauthorized partial food deliveries in late 2023 after the diversion scandal, the context had changed. AP News: the US efforts to re-engage faced stiffer obstacles: distrust, bureaucratic delays, and the fact that many communities had adapted to new Indian alternatives. The changing dynamic was clear in USAID's own restructuring. In July 2025, the U.S. announced that critical USAID programs in Ethiopia, humanitarian, health, food security, would now fall under State Department structures. Addis Standard, it suggested a retreat from developmental operations to more diplomacy-centered engagement. The U.S. was no longer the default aid actor in Ethiopia. It was now one among several, but challenges lie ahead for India's rise. Allegations are surfacing. Are Indian firms imposing hidden debts? Are local workers losing out to imported crews? Will transparency suffer? Already, critics in Addis whisper questions about new contracts awarded without open competition, about power agreements favoring Indian vendors, and toughest of all, whether India, too, will demand political loyalty or quiet influence in sensitive areas. In one dramatic twist, Ethiopia's government declined a US NGO-led agricultural project in a key region, opting instead for an Indian-backed rural development program combining seed inputs, digital farming, and low-interest credit. The U.S. lines went unused. The Indian program rolled in. Observers noted this was perhaps the clearest moment when USAID's legacy was overtaken. As dusk falls again, those trucks carrying solar modules and medical gear return along the same roads, now filled with more confidence. Distant silhouettes of mountains framble and waking to a new era of a rivalry in the final days of 2025. Ethiopia's choice has become a symbolic battleground. Will it rely on the old superpower that once dominated global aid, or lean more deeply into a rising power that promises development without condescension? This is not the end of USAID's story in Ethiopia. Some projects remain, some funding trickles back, but the monopoly is gone, and a new contest for influence, legitimacy, and control is now underway. In closing, the shift we see in Ethiopia is not simply about aid dollars. It is about ownership, narrative, sovereignty. It is about what relationships a nation chooses, and who writes its development script. The contest between India and the US in Ethiopia is raw, strategic, and ongoing, a new aid war in Africa whose outcome will shape not just who gives help, but who commands influence.